Mark thought he was just attending another casual party with his wife, Beth, surrounded by friends and laughter. But nothing could have prepared him for the shocking revelation that would unravel his world in a single night. As the evening unfolds, a seemingly innocent game among friends takes a dark turn. Wives tossing keys into a bowl, and husbands randomly picking, deciding who they'll spend the night with. The rules are simple, the stakes are high, and Mark is about to discover that his wife, the woman he thought he knew, has kept a dangerous secret. When he realizes that Beth knew about the game and didn't tell him, his disbelief turns to fury. The night he thought would be like any other will become the night that changes everything, shattering trust, breaking hearts, and leaving Mark wondering if he ever truly knew his wife at all. It started like any other evening. Mark and Beth arrived at their friend's house, greeted by familiar faces and the usual small talk. The atmosphere was relaxed, casual, the kind of night that made you forget about the stress of daily life. Mark could almost feel the weight of the past week slipping off his shoulders as he accepted a drink, listening to the sounds of laughter and music filling the air. It was supposed to be a fun, carefree night, but it wasn't long before the atmosphere shifted in a way Mark could never have predicted. The host, an old friend from college, clinked his glass to gather everyone's attention. "All right, folks," he announced with a mischievous grin. "Tonight we're mixing things up a little. Let's spice it up and have some fun." Mark and Beth exchanged a brief glance, a fleeting look of curiosity but no hint of concern. After all, they were used to the occasional party game. It was all in good fun, wasn't it? The host continued, his voice full of excitement. "We're going to play a game, a little something different this time." He gestured to a bowl in the middle of the table. "Each of the wives will drop their keys into this bowl. Then the husbands will randomly pick a key. Simple enough, right?" The crowd chuckled, a few people making jokes about the game being a little risky, but nothing more than playful teasing. Mark felt a chuckle rise in his chest too, but it quickly faltered when he noticed the lingering look of amusement on some of the other couples' faces. There was something in their eyes, a knowing look that Mark couldn't quite place, but that made his stomach tighten with unease. Beth, ever the social one, casually tossed her keys in the bowl with a playful grin, as if this was nothing more than a harmless game. Mark followed suit, trying to mask the strange feeling beginning to settle in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't until the first man picked a key and the host smiled broadly that the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. He watched as the man stood up, walking toward a woman across the room, a woman who wasn't his wife. The guests around them erupted into laughter, raising glasses and clinking them together in celebration. For a moment, Mark simply stared, frozen in place. He had never seen a game quite like this before. The tension in the air had shifted, and it was no longer playful banter. It was something else entirely. Something that made Mark feel out of place. And then it hit him, the terrible realization. The game wasn't just about fun or a harmless prank. It was about swapping partners. His stomach lurched, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as he turned to look at Beth. Her face had changed. There was no longer a playful smile, but something else, something he couldn't immediately place. She seemed unfazed by the spectacle unfolding before them, and that's when it hit him, the worst part of all. Beth had known about this. She had known about the game, and she hadn't said a word to him. Mark's heart started pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing, unable to keep up with the growing fury and betrayal threatening to consume him. He leaned toward her, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What is this? What the hell is going on here?" Beth looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, as if the realization had finally hit her too, she shrugged casually, her lips curling into an almost apologetic smile. "It's just a game, Mark. No big deal." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, her casual dismissal of something so profoundly invasive, only deepening the betrayal Mark felt. She'd known and she hadn't told him. His mind began to race, searching for some kind of explanation, but there was none. His gut was screaming at him that something wasn't right. But in that moment, all he could hear was the laughter from the party, echoing in his ears, making him feel more and more like an outsider. What was once a simple evening of drinks and conversation had now spiraled into something darker, something he could not walk away from. As the game continued, Mark's world began to tilt. He could no longer ignore the sinking feeling that something was irreparably wrong. But the truth, the undeniable truth, was clear now. This wasn't just a game. It was a test of his trust, his marriage, and his resolve. And Mark wasn't sure if he was ready for the answer that was about to be revealed. As the night progressed, Mark's discomfort grew with every passing minute. The laughter and clinking of glasses seemed to echo in his ears, distant and hollow, as though he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He tried to focus on the conversation around him, to join in on the jokes and casual chatter, but it felt like he was watching everything from behind a glass wall. The realization kept gnawing at him. The game wasn't just a game. And Beth had known about it. She'd known and hadn't said a word to him. His hands clenched into fists, and his stomach twisted with a mix of anger and confusion. It was supposed to be a fun night, a break from the routine, but now it felt like everything he thought he knew about their marriage was crumbling before his eyes. He kept glancing over at Beth, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm that was building inside him. How could she be so unfazed? Why hadn't she warned him? Was this something she'd wanted all along? Mark could feel the heat of his rising anger, a tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess, but one question kept repeating in his mind. How long had she been keeping this from him? The thought of her casually tossing her keys into that bowl, her participation in this sick game, it made him sick to his stomach. He had been blindsided, caught completely off guard by something he never imagined could happen. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The noise silenced the room and all eyes turned toward him. Mark's voice was sharp, his fury barely contained. "Beth," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "What the hell is this? You knew about this, didn't you?" Beth, caught off guard, looked at him with a mix of confusion and surprise. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Mark saw a flicker of something. Guilt? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She tried to smile, but it felt forced, hollow. "Mark, it's just a game," she said, her voice laced with a nonchalant calm that only made his anger burn hotter. "It's not that big of a deal." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing. His voice grew louder, more incredulous. "A game?" His eyes searched her face, desperate for an explanation, but all he saw was the woman he thought he knew, replaced by someone unrecognizable. "How could you keep this from me, Beth? How could you not tell me?" His hands balled into fists, and he struggled to keep his voice steady. "I'm supposed to trust you. We're supposed to be in this together. And you," his words faltered, caught in the whirlwind of betrayal. "You've been hiding this from me. You knew what was going to happen, and you didn't even warn me." Beth opened her mouth to speak, but Mark wasn't listening anymore. The pain in his chest was overwhelming, and all he could hear was the sound of his own voice, rising in anger and disbelief. He wasn't ready for this, not for the shock that had come crashing into his life, and certainly not from the woman he had married. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why was she so calm? Why was she so willing to let this happen? Beth looked around the room at the gathered guests, her face flushing with a tinge of embarrassment. She glanced back at Mark, but this time there was something different in her expression. Regret, perhaps, but it was overshadowed by something else. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer. "Mark," she began, her tone more conciliatory now. "Look, maybe I didn't handle this the right way, but it doesn't have to be a big deal. It could be fun, a way to, spice things up. Just give it a chance." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The words she was saying felt foreign, like they belonged to a stranger. Spice things up? Was this what their marriage had come to? A game where trust was thrown away like a cheap toy? "No," he said, his voice firm, cutting her off before she could say anything more. "I'm not playing this game, Beth. I don't want any part of this. You didn't even have the decency to talk to me about it first. You've betrayed me in a way I can't even begin to comprehend." His fists clenched tighter, his jaw set. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice steady, though every part of him wanted to scream. "And you can either come with me or stay here, but if you stay, don't bother coming back." The finality of the words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. The room was silent, the weight of his declaration pressing down on everyone in the room. Beth's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and uncertainty. She stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, don't leave. Please. We can talk about this. I didn't mean to hurt you. Just give it a chance. Maybe it'll make things better between us." But Mark's mind was already made up. He turned and walked toward the door, the eyes of the room following him, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could hear Beth's voice calling after him. And for the first time in their marriage, he didn't care. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as Mark stormed toward the door, the weight of his decision bearing down on him with each step. His mind was a whirlwind of disbelief and raw emotion. He had never felt this helpless, this betrayed. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who believed in loyalty, trust, and love. But tonight, those principles had been shattered, crushed under the weight of his wife's actions. Beth's voice rang out behind him, weak and desperate. "Mark, wait. Please don't leave like this," she pleaded, her voice trembling. The sound of her calling his name made his chest tighten, but there was no turning back. His heart screamed in pain, but his mind was resolute. He had to leave. If he didn't, he would lose everything. "Mark, we can talk about this." Beth's voice grew more insistent, following him toward the door. "Please, I didn't mean for it to get this far. It was just a game. Just one night. It's not the end of everything. We can fix this. I swear we can." He stopped at the door, his hand on the handle. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of them were prepared to face. He turned slowly, his face hard, his eyes filled with a mix of hurt and fury. "No, Beth," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's not just one night. It's everything. You've disrespected me, you've lied to me, and now you want me to pretend like nothing happened?" He shook his head, the pain in his chest becoming almost unbearable. "I can't do that. I can't just forgive you because you say it was just a game." Beth took a step forward, her face a mix of frustration and confusion. "You don't understand, Mark. This could have been something good for us, something exciting. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it is." Mark's anger flared again, and he stepped closer to her, his voice rising. "I understand perfectly. You went behind my back. You didn't even give me the chance to decide what I wanted. This wasn't just some harmless fun. You destroyed the trust we built. How am I supposed to ever look at you the same way again?" He paused, his emotions momentarily overtaken by the reality of the situation. The woman he had married, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, was now a stranger. The love he had once felt for her seemed like a distant memory, tainted by her betrayal. It was in that moment that Mark realized just how broken he was, and how broken their marriage had become. With a deep breath, he stood tall, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm not staying here, Beth. I'm not going to pretend this is something I can just overlook. Either you leave with me now, or you stay here and we're done. But I'm not coming back to this. I'm done." Beth's face faltered, a flash of panic crossing her features. "Mark, please don't do this. Don't make a decision like this in the heat of the moment. Let's just go home and we'll talk. I promise, I'll make it up to you. We'll fix this." Mark's heart ached at the desperation in her voice, but he knew it was too late. He had to do this for himself, for his own dignity. He had to take control of his life again, even if it meant walking away from everything he had known. "Make it up to me?" he repeated, his voice cold, distant. "How do you even begin to make up for something like this? You've already made your choice, Beth, and now I'm making mine." He took a step back, heading for the door. "I'm leaving. You have a choice to make. But whatever you decide, don't ever think I'll forget what you did." With that, he swung the door open and stepped into the cool night air, leaving Beth standing there, rooted to the spot. Her eyes filled with tears, but Mark didn't turn back. He couldn't. As he climbed into his car, the weight of the night's events settled heavily on his shoulders. The engine hummed to life, but Mark didn't drive off immediately. He sat in the car, staring at the street ahead, trying to steady his breathing. His hands were shaking, his heart was broken, but beneath the raw pain there was also a sense of clarity, of resolution. He had done the right thing. He had walked away from a betrayal so deep, He couldn't fathom ever returning to the same life. As he drove away, the realization hit him. He wasn't just leaving Beth. He was leaving the person he used to be. The person who had trusted, who had believed in their love. That person no longer existed. And as much as it hurt, Mark knew he had to keep moving forward. Beth had made her choice, and now Mark was choosing to move on, to reclaim his dignity, his peace, and his future without her. The drive home felt like an eternity, each minute stretching longer than the last. The silence between them in the car was suffocating. Mark kept his eyes focused on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel, as if holding on to something, anything that could keep him grounded. His heart ached, the sting of betrayal still fresh, but he refused to look at Beth. He couldn't bear to see her right now, to see the woman he once loved reduced to a stranger. Beth, sitting beside him in the passenger seat, stared straight ahead. Her hands rested on her lap, unmoving. The car hummed with the sound of the engine, but it was as though they were both in a vacuum, worlds apart. Every so often, Mark could feel her eyes on him, but he refused to acknowledge her presence. She had chosen this night, chosen the game, chosen to break his trust. And now, he wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. After what felt like hours of deafening silence, Beth spoke, her voice tentative and unsure. "Mark, please talk to me. Don't do this. Don't leave me." Her words hung in the air like a plea, desperate and filled with fear. Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream, to let all the anger and hurt pour out of him, but instead he held it in, forcing himself to stay calm, forcing himself to think. "You think I'm gonna just forget this, Beth?" He finally spoke, his voice cold, though there was a tremor of pain beneath it. "You think I can just let you walk away from this unscathed?" Beth's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't look at him either. Her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, as though avoiding his eyes might make the situation somehow less real. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. I thought it would be fun, just a way to, I don't know, break out of the routine. We've been stuck in this rut for so long, Mark. I thought it would make things better." Mark's grip on the wheel tightened and his heart wrenched. She didn't get it. She didn't understand the gravity of what she had done. This wasn't just about breaking the routine or trying to spice things up. This was about breaking trust, shattering the foundation of their marriage. "Don't you get it, Beth?" Mark's voice cracked slightly, the pain seeping through the cracks of his control. "You didn't just play some game. You chose to betray me. You made a decision without even thinking about how it would affect me, how it would destroy us." Beth's breath hitched as she turned toward him, her voice almost pleading. "I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't think it would go this far. But I'm asking you, please, let's talk. Let's fix this. I know I made a huge mistake, but I'm still your wife. We've been through so much together." Mark's chest tightened. Her words, the way she begged, made it harder to breathe. He wanted to forgive her. He wanted to believe that they could move past this, that maybe this was just a bad decision, a mistake that could be fixed. But the part of him that trusted her, that believed in their vows, had been shattered. The foundation they had built their life on was cracked beyond repair. "Do you even hear yourself, Beth?" His voice was low, tinged with heartbreak. "How am I supposed to look at you the same way again? How do I know you won't betray me again? This isn't just about tonight. This is about everything. About how little you thought of me when you made that decision. I don't know if I can ever get over that." Beth's eyes filled with more tears, and she reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on his arm. "Mark, please. I love you. Don't let this destroy us. I can't lose you." For a moment, Mark's heart wavered. He felt the pull of the woman he had loved for so many years. The woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin. But then the memory of her sitting there, so casually participating in that game, flashed before his eyes. Her willingness to let someone else touch her, to betray him in the most intimate way possible, it was a wound that wouldn't heal. The car came to a stop at a red light, and Mark took a deep breath, staring ahead. His mind raced, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to make a decision. "I'm leaving, Beth," he said, his voice firm now, a finality to it that left no room for argument. "This marriage, it's over. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I'm walking away." Beth's face crumpled, her shoulders shaking with sobs as she reached for him, but he pulled away, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let her guilt or her tears manipulate him into staying. He had to do what was right for him, for his future. With a sharp exhale, Mark shifted the car into drive and pulled away, leaving the woman he had once loved behind. The weight of the decision settled over him, heavy and painful, but in that moment, he knew it was the only choice he could make. He couldn't stay, not after what she had done. As the car pulled away, Mark felt a strange mixture of numbness and sadness. This was the end, and now, the painful journey of healing, of rebuilding his life, would begin. The sting of betrayal was still sharp in Mark's chest as he pulled into the driveway of his mother's house. The cold, unsettling silence of the car contrasted with the chaos raging inside him. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he killed the engine, his mind replaying the events of the night. Beth's face, so desperate, so broken, haunted him. And yet, despite the emotional turmoil that had nearly torn him apart, he knew he had done the right thing. Walking away was the only choice left. But what came next was another kind of pain he hadn't yet prepared for. He stepped out of the car, his thoughts swirling like a storm as he walked toward the front door. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. A call from Ted, one of the men who had been at the party. Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the phone. He didn't want to hear from anyone right now, especially not someone involved in this mess. But the call persisted, and his curiosity got the better of him. He answered it, the uncertainty in his gut twisting as he raised the phone to his ear. Mark. Hey, man. Ted's voice came through, casual but laced with an undercurrent of something Mark couldn't quite place. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know you're pissed about what happened tonight, but I thought you might want to know. Mark's stomach churned, an immediate sense of dread creeping in. What is it, Ted? Just get to the point. Ted's voice dropped a little, sounding almost apologetic, but still with a tone that made Mark's skin crawl. Beth, she was pretty eager about the whole thing. She was talking like it was the best night of her life, told us it was unforgettable, said she had a hell of a time with Brian. Mark's heart stopped. The name hit him like a sucker punch. Brian. The man who had been part of the twisted game that had shattered his marriage. The realization that Beth, his wife, had not only participated, but had openly reveled in the experience, twisted something deep inside him. Ted's voice continued, oblivious to the storm he was setting off. She said it was everything she'd ever wanted, told us Brian was, well, you know, she was really into it. I don't think she was planning on coming home with you, man. She was talking about how she was gonna let loose, enjoy herself without any regrets. Mark's throat tightened as Ted's words washed over him. The images flooded his mind. Beth, his wife, laughing and talking about another man in the most intimate terms. Brian, a man who wasn't Mark. A man she had chosen to share herself with, while Mark sat in the dark, unaware, trying to salvage a relationship he thought was built on trust and love. I gotta go, Ted. Mark managed, his voice thin and hoarse. Without waiting for a response, he ended the call. He stood frozen in the driveway, phone still in hand, as the weight of the betrayal crushed him. Beth hadn't just made a mistake. She had eagerly embraced the idea of being with someone else. She had wanted it. The love and commitment he had poured into their marriage meant nothing to her in that moment, and that realization cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. Before he could collect his thoughts, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Beth. His first instinct was to throw the phone away, to pretend like he hadn't seen the incoming call, but some primal need for closure, pulled him toward it. He answered the call, his voice cold and distant, barely masking the fury that burned beneath the surface. Mark, please, I know you're hurt, but listen to me, please. Beth's voice trembled, full of raw emotion. I know I messed up, but you don't understand. What happened with Brian, it didn't mean anything. It was just physical. It didn't have any emotional weight, I swear. Mark clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into a fist. No, Beth. It means everything. You've crossed a line I can never forget. You were talking about it like it was some kind of victory, like you couldn't wait to throw it in my face. It wasn't just physical. It was a complete betrayal. Beth's voice wavered, her words falling into a frantic, apologetic tone. I'm so sorry, Mark. Please, Just give me a chance to explain. I made a huge mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, try to move past it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just don't give up on me. Mark felt the pit of his stomach twist in disbelief. How could she possibly think he could just forgive her? The betrayal wasn't something she could fix with apologies or promises of therapy. It wasn't about the physical act. It was the emotional connection she had formed with someone else, someone who wasn't him. Beth, it's over, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of sadness and finality. I can't do this anymore. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Beth's voice cracked on the other end of the line, but Mark didn't waver. He ended the call without another word, feeling the weight of her words still ringing in his ears, yet knowing deep down that no amount of apologies or explanations could undo what had been done. His heart ached for the woman she had been, but the woman in front of him, the one who had betrayed him so utterly, was someone he could no longer love. As he stood in the driveway, his phone still in his hand, Mark realized that this was it. His marriage was over. The love he had once had for Beth was gone, replaced by a cold, bitter reality, and there was no going back. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers in front of him, his hands trembling as he stared down at the document. The weight of it seemed to press down on him, both physically and emotionally. The finality of it all was undeniable. His marriage was ending. The life he had built with Beth, one full of shared dreams, memories, and promises, was crumbling. And though he had made the decision to walk away, the reality of it was still sinking in. He had called a lawyer earlier that day, someone he trusted to guide him through the labyrinth of divorce proceedings. The moment he made the decision to take that step, to actually file for divorce, it felt like an anchor had been lifted from his chest. But now that he was here, with the papers in hand, the enormity of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't just about ending a relationship, it was about the future. His children, his assets, his emotional recovery. The stakes were high, and Mark knew he had to approach everything with the same precision he had once given to his career. The emotional turbulence could no longer cloud his judgment. Mark had always prided himself on being level-headed, but as he made the first few calls to get advice, the reality of his situation started to set in. He was in uncharted territory, and everything felt alien. What should he do first? What did he need to prepare for? He felt like a man out of control, trying desperately to stay afloat in a sea of uncertainty. His first call had been to his brother, Tony, a man who had always been a pillar of support during difficult times. Tony's response was immediate, but it lacked the empathy Mark had hoped for. He could hear the disbelief in Tony's voice, the confusion over how things had deteriorated so quickly between Mark and Beth. "I never thought she'd do something like this," Tony had said. "But man, you've got to do what's best for you now. You've got the kids to think about. She doesn't deserve to have any say in your future after what she did." It was hard to hear those words, even though he knew deep down they were true. Beth's actions had not only affected him, but had already begun to impact his children, and that was the most painful part. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting to protect his kids from the consequences of their mother's betrayal. The second call was to a financial advisor, someone he had worked with in the past. He needed to understand what kind of financial repercussions a divorce would have. Would he have to pay alimony? Would he lose everything he had worked so hard for? The advisor walked him through the process, helping him understand his rights and responsibilities in a way that gave him a bit more clarity. But the fear of the unknown still lingered. He had worked hard to provide for his family, and the thought of losing half of it was terrifying. The next day, he met with his lawyer in person. It was an uncomfortable experience, to say the least. The lawyer's office was sleek and impersonal, full of legal jargon and the coldness of a place that dealt with painful decisions every day. As the lawyer began to lay out his strategy for the divorce, Mark couldn't help but feel like a bystander in his own life. The thought of fighting over custody, over the children he loved, was almost too much to bear. But it was clear that he couldn't trust Beth to make the right choices for their family anymore. "I don't care about the money," Mark said, his voice low and steady as he looked the lawyer in the eye. "I want custody of my children. I want to protect them from everything that's happened, and I don't want to have to pay for Beth's mistakes. She made this bed, and now she has to lie in it." The lawyer nodded, taking careful notes. "We'll make sure we position you for the best outcome, Mark. With the evidence you have, the recordings, the texts, this is going to be a tough case for her." Mark's mind swirled. There was no turning back now. He had to be strategic, pragmatic, and focused, even though his heart ached with every decision he made. The most difficult part was still ahead, facing Beth. The last time he had seen her, it had been an emotional exchange, but the weight of the divorce papers would make their next confrontation even harder. How would he explain to her that their children, the ones they had raised together, would now be living in two different homes? How could he explain that her actions had forever changed the course of their lives? In the days that followed, Mark did his best to keep things normal for the children. He took them to school, helped them with their homework, and tried to shield them from the emotional wreckage that had consumed him. But each time they asked about Mom, he could feel the truth clawing at him. He wasn't sure when the right time would come to explain the divorce to them or how they would even begin to understand it. But he knew one thing for sure: he would never let Beth's mistakes define their future. He would protect them from the fallout, no matter what it took. The days following Mark's decision to divorce were a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and relentless emotional turmoil. As he signed the final paperwork to file for divorce, Mark felt as though he was stepping into a new life, one he hadn't chosen, but was now forced to navigate. His mind replayed the moments he had spent with Beth, their shared moments of happiness, now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. It was a strange kind of grief, a mourning for a life he could never return to. Mark's lawyer, a sharp and experienced professional named Andrea, had laid out a clear plan of action. She had already gathered the evidence he had provided: the recordings of Beth's admissions, her conversations with Ted and others at the party, and the text messages where she had trivialized the affair. Andrea was confident that the evidence would strengthen Mark's case for both custody and a favorable financial settlement. But even with this, Mark felt no sense of triumph. The stakes had never been higher, and the emotional cost of the entire ordeal weighed on him heavily. Every conversation with Andrea felt like a step closer to the inevitable, and yet it was impossible to ignore the deep pangs of loss that still lingered in Mark's chest. The decision to move forward with the divorce wasn't about punishing Beth. It was about survival. It was about protecting the life he had left, his children, his peace of mind, and his dignity. Mark's focus, however, had shifted to the children. He couldn't help but wonder how they would cope with the fallout of their mother's actions. The questions had already started. Why isn't Mommy home? Where is she going? At first, Mark had been unsure how to respond. It was too early to tell them the full truth, but he knew they couldn't be shielded forever. He would have to explain to them, when the time was right, that their mother's choices had led to the breakdown of their family. The thought of breaking their hearts tore at him, but he couldn't allow Beth's actions to dictate their future. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings were becoming more difficult. Beth had retained her own attorney, a tough negotiator who made it clear that they would fight for joint custody and that Mark would not be able to easily secure sole custody of the children. The negotiations became increasingly heated as Beth's lawyer dug into Mark's past, questioning his financial stability, his role as a father, and his ability to provide for the children. Mark had expected it, but the personal nature of the attacks still stung. Every word felt like a strike against his character, and though he knew he had to remain calm, the anger simmered beneath the surface. When the day arrived for the initial court hearing, Mark was nervous but resolute. He had prepared for this moment, knowing it would set the tone for the rest of the proceedings. As he sat in the cold, sterile courtroom, surrounded by strangers, he couldn't help but feel like a failure. This wasn't the life he had envisioned for his children. But he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. He was fighting for his family, for the children he loved so dearly. The court session was a blur. His lawyer presented the evidence of Beth's infidelity, outlining the emotional and financial toll it had taken on Mark. The recordings were played in full, and Mark watched as Beth's face twisted with embarrassment, guilt, and defensiveness. She tried to downplay her actions, to portray herself as a victim in all of this, but Mark could see through the charade. Her attempts to minimize the gravity of what had happened fell on deaf ears. The judge listened carefully, taking in every detail, and Mark couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that for once, the truth would win out. However, there was still no certainty. The case wasn't closed, and the process dragged on for weeks. Mark felt as if he were caught in an endless cycle of meetings, paperwork, and tense conversations with Andrea. Each step forward was tempered by the emotional toll the divorce was taking on him. The days stretched on, and he found himself oscillating between moments of anger, sadness, and numbness. His world had been turned upside down, and no matter how much he tried to focus on the future, the past kept pulling him back. And then there was Beth's constant presence in his thoughts. She was still fighting for the life they had built, clinging to the idea of reconciliation despite everything that had transpired. Her calls, though fewer now, still carried a desperate tone. She begged him to reconsider, to think of the family they once had. But Mark knew that whatever bond they had once shared was irrevocably broken. Her betrayal had shattered everything, and no amount of pleading could change that. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Mark knew that he couldn't let himself get lost in the emotional fog. He had to remain focused, for his children, for his future. The divorce was just the first step toward rebuilding his life, and he would not allow Beth's actions to define who he became. As difficult as it was to accept, the reality was clear. His marriage was over. But the fight for his children's well-being and his own peace of mind had just begun. The emotional aftermath of the divorce was more intense and isolating than Mark had ever anticipated. Even as the legal proceedings moved forward, he found himself living in a perpetual state of exhaustion, both mentally and physically. The weight of losing his marriage, his family as he knew it, left him feeling like a shell of the person he once was. The house that had once been filled with laughter and shared memories now felt cold, empty, and foreign. He was surrounded by reminders of a life he could no longer claim, and it hurt in ways he couldn't articulate. The divorce, though a step toward moving on, had triggered a flood of emotions that Mark struggled to control. There were moments when he'd sit in his living room, staring at the family photos on the walls, and he'd wonder where things had gone wrong. His mind replayed the pivotal moments: the party, Beth's betrayal, the heart-wrenching argument in the car. But it wasn't just the anger that consumed him. It was the deep sadness that accompanied the realization that everything they had built together was gone. His children, the one constant he had in his life, were now caught in the fallout, and that thought alone was enough to make his chest tighten with guilt. But even though his emotions were constantly in flux, Mark knew he couldn't afford to fall apart. He had to be strong, not just for himself, but for his children. They needed him more than ever, and he couldn't let them see him crumble. So he buried his pain beneath a veneer of stoicism, focusing on their needs and keeping up appearances for their sake. Every time his children asked why things were different, why mommy wasn't around, Mark felt his heart break just a little more. The questions were innocent, but they cut to the core of his internal struggle. How could he protect them from the harsh reality that their mother's actions had torn their family apart? Mark threw himself into work as a way to keep his mind occupied. It was easier to focus on the task at hand than to confront the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him. But even at work, he found it difficult to concentrate. Every phone call, every meeting, every interaction with a colleague felt like a distant echo of a life he used to lead. He tried to find solace in his daily routine, but it wasn't enough to mask the sadness that was creeping into every corner of his existence. His friends, too, were there for him, but their support couldn't fill the gaping hole that Beth had left behind. They were sympathetic, offering words of encouragement, but none of them truly understood the pain he was going through. They hadn't lived through the years of marriage, the moments of intimacy and connection that Mark had once thought would last a lifetime. They hadn't experienced the betrayal, the crushing weight of knowing that the person who had vowed to be by his side had instead chosen to betray him. One evening, After a particularly difficult day, Mark found himself at his best friend Greg's apartment. The two of them had known each other for years, and Greg had always been someone Mark could rely on, someone who would listen without judgment. Over a couple of beers, Mark vented his frustrations. He spoke of the anger he felt toward Beth, the confusion he couldn't shake, and the overwhelming sadness that seemed to seep into every aspect of his life. "I don't even know who I am anymore," Mark said, his voice breaking. "It feels like everything I've worked for, everything I believed in is just gone. I don't recognize myself in the mirror. How do I move forward when all I want is to go back?" Greg, though quiet at first, gave Mark a long, understanding look. "You can't go back," he said softly. "I know it hurts. It sucks, man, but you can only go forward. I know you think your whole world is falling apart right now, but trust me, this won't define you forever. You're stronger than you know." Those words lingered with Mark long after he left Greg's apartment. There was some comfort in hearing that his pain was temporary, even if the thought of moving forward felt impossible. But every day was a struggle. There were times when Mark felt like he was treading water, his emotions threatening to pull him under, but he couldn't afford to let himself drown. His children needed him, and despite the devastation that Beth's infidelity had caused, he had to find a way to keep going, for them. At night, when the house was quiet, Mark sometimes allowed himself to break down. The silence was deafening, and in those moments the tears came. Tears of anger, frustration, confusion, and grief. He missed the life he had lost, the family he had once believed in. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Mark began to realize that this pain, though consuming, wouldn't last forever. The process of emotional recovery was slow, but with time, Mark started to rebuild his sense of self. He surrounded himself with friends who supported him, and he leaned on them when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. More importantly, he focused on his children, knowing that his healing process would set the example for them. His marriage was over, but his role as a father, his love for his children, would endure. The final confrontation between Mark and Beth was inevitable. In the months following their separation, Beth had tried time and again to reach out to Mark, sending texts, making phone calls, and showing up at his doorstep. She couldn't seem to accept that their marriage was truly over, and she wasn't ready to give up on the life they had once shared. But for Mark, there was no going back. He had made his decision, and no amount of pleading or remorse from Beth could change it. One afternoon, Mark received another call from her. This time, he wasn't prepared for what came next. The conversation started like all the others. Beth apologizing, attempting to rationalize her actions, and begging him to reconsider the divorce. She told him that she regretted everything, that she had made a mistake, and that she still loved him. But Mark could hear the desperation in her voice, the same voice that had once whispered promises of love and loyalty, now trying to fix what could never be fixed. "I know I've hurt you, Mark. I know I've destroyed everything, but please, we can start over. We can rebuild," Beth said, her voice breaking. Mark felt the familiar pang of anger rise within him. He had heard this same script too many times before. The words meant nothing now. They were empty, a mere reflection of the guilt she felt over the consequences of her actions. He had once believed in her, trusted her, and loved her unconditionally. But now that trust had been shattered, and the anger he felt toward her had only deepened with time. "No," Mark replied, his voice firm. "I'm not doing this anymore. I can't keep listening to you make excuses. You made your choices, Beth, and I made mine. This marriage is over." Beth, undeterred, pushed harder. "Please, Mark, we can fix this. Don't let this one mistake define us. We can get through this. We've been through worse." The word stung. How could she possibly call it just a mistake? How could she downplay the depth of her betrayal, the extent of her actions? It was no longer just about the affair. It was about everything that had led to this moment. It was about the years of deceit, the erosion of trust, and the emotional destruction that had taken root in their marriage. To Mark, this wasn't a simple mistake. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, one that had irreparably damaged their bond. Mark's frustration boiled over. "A mistake? You think sleeping with another man, after everything we've been through, is just a mistake?" He snapped, his voice rising. You think that we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend like nothing happened? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark could hear Beth's shallow breaths as if she was struggling to find the right words. Then she spoke again, but this time it wasn't the apology he was expecting. It wasn't the pleading voice he'd heard before. It was something different, a voice tinged with defensiveness, perhaps even anger. "You don't understand, Mark," Beth said, her voice trembling but forceful. "You never did. This wasn't just about me. It was about us. Our marriage was already falling apart, and maybe this was just what I needed. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. I want to fix it. Please." Mark's heart sank. The words stung not because of what she was saying, but because of what they revealed about her. She wasn't taking full responsibility for her actions. She was still trying to place the blame on the marriage, on their relationship. It was as though, in her mind, the affair had been justified. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was a result of something larger. But Mark knew that wasn't true. He had never been perfect, but he had never crossed that line. He had never betrayed her. "I'm not listening to this anymore," Mark said, his voice cold. "I've made my decision, Beth. The marriage is over, and I'm not gonna let you manipulate me into thinking otherwise. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." There was a long silence. Beth's voice, once full of desperation, now seemed to soften. "Please, Mark, don't do this. You don't have to end it like this. We're better than this. I can change." Mark could feel the familiar tug in his chest, the part of him that wanted to believe her, to hold on to the memories of the good times. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The damage was too great, the trust too broken. He had given everything to this marriage, and in return, he had been betrayed in the worst possible way. There was no going back. "Goodbye, Beth," Mark said, his voice low but resolute. "This is the last time I'm going to say this. It's over. I'm done." He hung up the phone, his hands trembling slightly, but his resolve unwavering. As the finality of the conversation settled in, Mark took a deep breath. He had made his peace with the decision, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Walking away from a marriage was never simple, but Mark knew he had to do it. For himself, for his children, for his future. In the days that followed, Beth continued to reach out, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but Mark ignored them all. He knew that the more he engaged with her, the harder it would be to stay firm in his decision. The pain of the final confrontation lingered in his mind, but each time he thought of the life he had lost, he reminded himself that it was a life he could never return to. He had to move on, no matter how difficult it was. Beth had tried to reconcile, but Mark had made it clear. There was no going back. The damage had been done, and the marriage that had once held so much promise had been irrevocably destroyed. Now, it was time for Mark to step into the next chapter of his life, no matter how painful it seemed. The resolution of Mark's journey was a slow, painful process, marked by a series of realizations that over time would begin to ease the sharpness of his grief. After the final confrontation with Beth, Mark found himself in a place he had never imagined he would be, standing at the threshold of his life without the woman he had once pledged to spend forever with. The marriage was officially over, and yet the weight of the finality settled into him like an anchor. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Mark knew there was no other choice. The love they once shared had been eclipsed by betrayal, and no amount of apologies or promises could undo what had been done. The days following the divorce were some of the most challenging Mark had ever faced. There were moments when he questioned his decision, when doubt crept in and whispered that perhaps he could have fought harder, tried one last time to salvage what was left. But each time, the clarity came rushing back. Beth's betrayal had fractured the foundation of their marriage beyond repair. She had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. The person who had once been his confidant and partner had become a stranger, one whose actions had left a scar that would never fully heal. In the silence of his home, Mark began to focus on what came next. He couldn't afford to dwell in the past, no matter how tempting it was to do so. The future had to be his focus now, not just for his own sake, but for his children. They were his priority, the anchor that kept him grounded. His role as their father had never felt more important than it did in those early days of the separation. They needed stability, and despite the storm raging inside him, Mark knew that he had to be the calm in their lives. With each passing day, Mark found a way to rebuild his routine, to find small moments of normalcy in the chaos. His work became a temporary distraction, giving him the space to focus on something other than his heartbreak. But even as he threw himself into his career, Mark couldn't deny the emotional toll that the divorce had taken on him. He was constantly exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The grief didn't subside overnight, and the pain of losing the family he had once dreamed of lingered long after the legal proceedings had ended. But as time went on, Mark began to see glimpses of light. He found support in the friends who had stood by him, offering comfort, advice, and a sense of community that he hadn't realized he needed. Greg, in particular, had been an unwavering source of support, someone who understood the depths of Mark's pain and yet encouraged him to look beyond the present darkness. "You're not alone in this, man," Greg had told him, "and you won't be forever. This is just a chapter, not the whole story." Mark also found solace in moments of solitude, when he could reflect on who he was becoming. There were times when he would sit in his living room, staring out the window at the setting sun, and he would think about the person he was before all of this had happened. The man who had been full of hope, ambition, and love. That man hadn't disappeared entirely. He was still there, waiting to reclaim his life. Mark started to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of his marriage. His passion for hobbies, his desire to travel, and his ambition to improve himself all began to resurface. The hardest part, of course, was adjusting to the absence of Beth. No longer did he share his bed with someone he had once loved with all his heart. No longer did he have the comfort of her voice, her presence, her touch. The empty spaces in their home were constant reminders of the life he had lost. But Mark had also learned that he couldn't keep looking back. He had to focus on what he had now, his children, his friends, and the future he was building. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten, and it was his to shape. Mark began to set new goals for himself, ones that were not tied to his past life with Beth. He enrolled in a personal development course to reconnect with his aspirations, something he had put on hold for years in the rush of family life. He started training for a marathon, something that had always been on his bucket list, but had never been possible while juggling a demanding job and family life. Each step he took, each goal he accomplished, helped him reclaim his sense of self-worth, reminding him that he was more than the man who had been hurt by his wife's infidelity. As for Beth, Mark had made his peace with the fact that their relationship was over. Her repeated attempts to reconcile had become less frequent, and with each missed call, Mark felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. He no longer felt the need to engage with her, no longer needed the validation of her apologies. He had forgiven her, not because she deserved it, but because he deserved the peace that came with letting go. One evening, as he stood in his kitchen, making dinner for his children, Mark realized that he had reached a place where he could finally move forward. The anger that had consumed him for months had faded into a quiet acceptance. The sadness still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. He was learning to live with it, finding strength in the smallest of moments. His heart was scarred, but it wasn't broken beyond repair. He could see a future now, a future where his children grew up happy and healthy, where he could be a good father, and perhaps in time, a partner to someone new who could understand and appreciate the person he had become. Mark's journey wasn't over, but he had crossed a crucial threshold. He had survived the worst of it. And now, as he tucked his children into bed that night, he realized that life would go on. The future was uncertain, but it was his to claim.